Hey folks, we are so excited for this next module, The Home You Want. This is something that we feel so passionate about. Like every parent out there, man, even if we were raised in a great home, there were still things to be desired. There were still things that weren't quite right or had a negative impact, even if it was a really great place overall. And I think that's the thing that's so hopeful to me about our relationship with the Lord is we always have the ability to create the reset. I know that we've committed to break generational curses. We've committed to create the space in our home that creates all the things that we want in our kids' lives that we didn't get in ours.
Yeah.
One of the things I've heard people say before is you can't give what you don't have. And I reject that lie. I think that I can give what I didn't have because that's part of my inheritance
Right.
in the kingdom of God is the ability to infuse into my children's lives the things that my parents didn't even know to infuse into mine. And so even being raised in a Christian home, there were a lot of things that were left to be desired that I believe that I can infuse. And so this next module, these next 3 sessions is really about that.
Yeah.
Hey, let's have vision for our home and let's create the environment that we want to see created with our children and our marriage and in the space that we have control over.
Yes. So we're kicking it off with kill the talk. And the whole concept is that we have been raised in this culture with this idea of you just have to talk one day. And even then it's like the talk is the birds and the bees. And you're like, what is that even? And there's so much pressure that is built
Yeah.
up over time because we think one day, probably when we're in high school, it's really going to end up being way too little, way too late because they've already heard so
And
much.
everybody hates it. Mom and dad hate it.
So much
the kids hate
pressure.
it because
Yeah,
we're
you're
not used to
loathing
talk.
it.
It's just this horrible, high anxiety, low result scenario in conversation.
Yes. Yeah, we have to kill the entire idea of there just being one talk one day when we're talking about something as serious as the formation of our sexual identity and our character and understanding the body.
Yeah. So we're going to jump into that. We want to give you 5 tools, 5 really clear, practical tools of how you can kill the talk and create a series of conversations that are going to give a ton of life to your home, to your kids, and equip you to have really healthy conversations about sex and sexuality.
Yep. And part of the killing the talk and creating these conversations is realizing we have the power and the privilege of having first mention inside of our home. And so if we wait till this future end date, then we lose that. So
Yeah.
I love the idea of saying we get to say it first.
Exactly. So tool number 1, we've already said it, is kill the talk. And we've got to know that's a tool in my tool belt. I've got to break up. I got to get rid of this idea that I'm going to have one conversation about sex with my kid. Commit to that right now. Commit to a culture that creates so much space. We're going to tell you how to do that. The reason that this is so important on a scientific level is for humans, sex is actually a learned behavior. It's not instinctive or innate like it is for most species on the planet. Do you know that humans are the only species that we're certain of that enjoy sex and experience mating outside of being in heat? Dolphins, there's some question there because dolphins actually are the only other species that do mate when they're not in heat. But outside of, and we don't know if they enjoy it. We don't have the science yet to fully understand that. But every other species only mates when they're actually fertile. Why? Because it's instinctive and it's innate. It's built into them to carry on their species, to procreate, so that there will be a next generation and a generation after that and a generation after that. But actually for humans, we're actually given the gift of the enjoyment of sex inside of marriage, outside of just the purpose of procreation. Why does that matter? Here's why that matters. It's really important for us to understand this concept. Because of our intelligence level, sex actually doesn't come natural to us. Sex isn't a natural thing to humans. We actually have to be taught, experienced, or informed of how to do it, because it's a learned behavior. Now, psychologists do go back and forth. Some would say it's a fully learned behavior. Others would say, no, it's innate, but it breaks all the innate rules. What's an innate or an instinctive behavior? It's something that does not have to be experienced for that species to know how to do it. It just naturally transpires, and that species is able to do it without any instruction. Well, with humans, sex actually has to be taught. So the challenge for that comes when mom and dad have decided we're going to only have a talk, but when they're 15 years old, when they're 14 and going into high school. Well, in our culture right now, and the massive amount of sexualization that's going on, by the time that talk has taken place, our children have already been exposed to sexuality hundreds of times. So what takes place in that brain is your child's subconscious takes whatever their first experience was, and then the subsequent experiences after that just reinforce that thought, reinforce that information. And now by the time mom and dad have come into the picture years later and hundreds of encounters later, not necessarily hundreds of sexual encounters, but hundreds of informational seed sowing moments where they walked by Victoria's Secret, they watched the movie, they saw the rom-com where sex was being experienced outside of marriage, whatever, all of those little moments. And for some, it was exposure to pornography by the age of 12. It was this, take the entire body of work of sexual understanding that takes place before a mom and dad's willing to talk about it. All of those, just the subconscious files them away, and says, this is sex, this is sex, this is sex. And it may not even be a conscious understanding for that child. It's a subconscious belief system that's being created. So now mom and dad come into the talk and say, hey, this is meant for marriage. This is meant for covenant. This is part of God's design. Everything in the subconscious of that child is yelling, lie, lie, lie. This isn't true. This isn't true. Sex can be casual. How do I know? Because my hundreds of experiences before mom and dad were ever willing to talk said sex is casual. Sex can be with multiple partners. Why? Because pornography has been a part of my life for the last 8 years before mom and dad were willing to talk about it. Sex can be, it's okay to be seen in lingerie in a public square. Why? Because I've walked past Victoria's Secret hundreds of times before mom and dad were willing to talk about it. Their subconscious actually doesn't know truth anymore because the lie was presented as truth for so long. This is why this first tool is probably the most important, why the entire session is built around this one concept. We have got to realize sex is learned, and our children are learning sex long before we're willing to talk about it. And if we don't get comfortable earlier and more often than we feel like we need to, by the time we've entered the conversation, our children have already had subconscious conversations for years, maybe even a decade before. Did you know there's 5 phases of sexual development, and the first phase is already completed by the age of 3? By the age of 3, that first phase of sexual development is already done. The 5th phase of sexual development ends at the completion of their brain becoming totally plastic and adult. So it varies between the age of 20 to 24. So we have these first 20 to 25 years to engage in ongoing healthy conversations so that we're a part of this subconscious development of their understanding of sex and sexuality. So it's so critical that we commit to this.
So I want to share a couple of tools with you. If we've caught you early enough where you're like, wow, okay, so how do I do this? If by 3 something's already happened, what am I supposed to do? So these are some tools that we're going to reference way more in detail later. But what I love about this is that it helps you feel equipped and empowered. Because I think a lot of times as parents, we're overwhelmed with all the things. So sex is like, I can avoid that one.
I'm just trying to get my kid not to cuss in front of people, right? Or whatever it is.
Or eat some broccoli, or like
don't lick that. Why do you always eat dirt?
Yeah, you're like, it's kind of relieving because we think, oh, we can just push that conversation off to later, and I don't have to even think about that hard thing. But instead, what these tools do is they equip and empower you as a parent to know, A, this is super age appropriate. This is the right thing to do. I don't have to do all of the research. I literally have this tool in my tool belt. So what we're so excited to say too about this entire series is we have the author coming on in a couple more sessions. You're going to get to hear directly from him. This is called the God's Design for Sex series, and it has over 1 million copies sold already. It has been an amazing resource for people. How and when to tell your kids about sex. It's a big book, and it's going to dive into what we can't do in just these 10 weeks with you. And it's written by a therapist, licensed in marriage, PhD, professor of psychology, and a Christian man who spoke at the Christian University for years and years. You're going to find out more about him. But it's a lifelong approach to sharing your child's sexual character. Shaping, sorry. So this is all for you. But here's what is the tool. get these if we've caught you early enough. These could be on your child's
Well,
bookshelf.
even if we haven't, it's never too late to start doing the right thing now.
Yes.
I would actually, on camera, disagree with my wife. Whether
That's
we've
fine.
caught you earlier enough or not, man, start doing the healthy thing today.
Yeah, that's so
God
good.
is so gracious to make up for lost time in parenting. Man,
No.
like my mom says all the time, like she didn't know anything when we were born, and she felt like the Lord was so gracious to make up for the things that she didn't know to do. God will be gracious with you if you start making the healthy choices now, and He's so good at making up for lost time.
That's so good. I'm glad you corrected that. So
You hear that? She was
basically,
glad I corrected her.
I
This is a
really
big
am.
moment in our marriage.
I really am. So we're not going to dive into each book right now, but what I want you to know is the hope and the empowerment of understanding age 3 to 5. So this is just like you read Goodnight Moon and all of the Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, all of those books that are on their shelf that they might pull off at night. It's also this. It's the story of me. It's understanding, oh, I was made in mommy's belly because mom and dad loved each other. So you get that power of first mention of saying, this is how God created me with mom and dad. The next book is for 5 to 8, and it's before I was born, God knew my name, and it teaches age appropriate things there. So again, you're like, oh, I'm on track. I'm teaching them what they need to know, that they know sex belongs to God. It's actually from heaven. 8 to 12, and then the last book is 12 to 16, y'all. So these are tools that are in your tool belt that you're like, oh wow, we are on track with saying God is the creator and author of sex, and mom
Yeah.
and dad are going to talk to me about it. And I know that they're my source.
So the great thing about these resources that Caitlin talked about is they actually address 4 of the most critical phases of sexual development. You know, that first phase is 0 to 3. There isn't a lot of information to be given in that phase. It's touch, physical touch, eye contact, and the way that we engage with our babies. Then as they get older and they move into age 3 and up, these create a ton of language, and they just really address what needs to be taught and said in those different moments. So now as we wrap up this first point of killing the talk, if I'm killing the talk, what am I doing? Well, that means I'm having a series of discovery conversations that start at an early age and continue on into high school and really even through high school. And so what we want to do here is we want to say, okay, no more talk. We're not waiting for this big moment in middle school or high school. We're actually having discovery conversations, and they go kind of simply like this. The kids are going around and saying sex or six or whatever version they've decided that they think they know something. And we just lean into that moment. You know, our boys were talking about sex. The younger one, the second one was saying sex, sex, sex. And the older one had his own input on it. We'll tell that story here in a little bit. But what we did at the end of this is we just said, well, what do you guys know about sex? Oh, we think it's kissing. Well, actually, it's not just kissing. It's more than that. There's more to it. Do you guys want to know right now? No, we don't want to know what sex is yet. Awesome, because we actually felt like you were too young. We just want to make sure that you know you could come and talk to us when you do.
Yeah.
It's a discovery conversation. I'm discovering what they know, what they think they know, and all the way up to now our oldest is in middle school, and he's got a girl that he likes, and she likes him. He gets in the car from school. I'm not just saying, how was the day? I'm saying, hey, did you talk to her today? Did she talk to you? Do you guys talk much? What's that like, right? And we're having a constant series of discovery conversations. So I'm discovering where his heart is at. I'm discovering where our kids' minds are at. I'm not hanging my hat on one talk. I'm hanging it on a series of intentional conversations to know what's going on in my kid's life.
Yes, I love it. Point number 2 is establish that sex is not a bad word.
Man, this is so big.
It's huge. Because obviously then that just brings the comfort of, oh, this isn't awkward.
Yeah.
But really what's happened is sex has gotten lumped in with it being almost like a cuss word, where like if people are spelling it out, they don't like write it out. They add an asterisk or something.
And you add vagina to that and penis, and we
Mhm.
get so uncomfortable when our kids become familiar with that stuff.
Because when we act uncomfortable, then that invites shame in,
Yeah.
really. Because then it's like, ooh, we don't talk about that. But especially starting from the young age with penis and vagina specifically is knowing, hey, you know, when they touch their ears or their nose, we're going to call it that. We're not going to be like, oh, don't touch your hoo-ha or your nee-nee
Or your ha-ha, yeah.
We actually label them the actual body parts that they are, so that shame isn't invited in to be like, oh, we don't talk about that area. It's like, hey, no, that's your penis.
Yeah.
Or, you know, my daughter once was like in the public restroom, like, Mom, you're rubbing my vagina too hard. I'm like, well, that sounds awkward to the people next to us probably, but it's like she's not calling it some awkward word that it's not. So another part of establishing sex isn't a bad word is realizing that from a young age, they can know sex is from heaven. Sex is a gift from God, and that we can say the word in our
And
home.
it's the gift that gave you life, child.
But a funny story that we will never forget in our
Ever.
house is our two oldest boys. The younger of the two loves to pester his older brother. Really, that could go both ways, right? They love to pester each other. But he loves to get a rise out of people still to this day. But when he was like 5, he was stomping around the living room so powerfully, yelling, sex. And I'm thinking, what the heck is happening right here? But he was just trying to irritate his older brother. What happened is he did not irritate him. His older brother put him in his place. So our older son replied and was like, that's not a bad word. It's actually from God. Just some people took it and like did the wrong stuff with it.
And we were like, we are the best parents on the planet. I could retire right now as a parent and I will have won.
We were very proud. And it was one of those moments where I grabbed my phone out just in time. You know, when your kid's doing something, you're like, oh, I want to get this on, record this. And I actually got this whole conversation on. But then it was hilarious as our older son then replied, but in high school, you're going to have some girls who want to do it to you.
And he was like devastated. Connor was like, no! Like it's the worst possible thing that could ever happen to him is that girls might want to have sex with him.
Well, and he was like, what?
I'm glad you think that now. That's going to change.
He was like, what? Why? Why are girls going to want to do it to me? He's like, well, it's because you're so handsome.
And what's so critical in that moment, though, and that's the conversation I was referencing a minute ago when we were talking about Kill the Talk, Kate joined the conversation, I joined the conversation. We casually talked about their view of this right there.
Yeah.
And Connor goes, oh, okay. And we said, well, what do you guys know about sex? And they shared with us what they knew about it. And we asked if they wanted to know more. And they came to the conclusion they weren't ready for that yet. And we just used that moment to have a discovery conversation, to hear where they're at. But more than anything, we established, hey, we could casually talk about this on the couch. And this didn't require some big, huge moment where we awkwardly made you talk about something you were uncomfortable talking about. We just talked, we created comfort around that. And we're establishing, hey, this is a good word. And we're all comfortable dialoguing about this together.
It feels like a normal conversation of the day. It's not like we made a big deal that then they're always going to remember, oh, that's so awkward. I don't want to talk about mom and dad with that.
So kill the talk. Establish sex isn't a bad word. Yes. And number 3.
And number 3 is no question is a bad question. We want our kids to know that we are the source. We are establishing we are the source. We accept and celebrate all of your questions. You kind of have to have just like a really good poker face, right? Because the questions come at really awkward, inappropriate, unexpected times. And you just have to have your best poker face because when they ask a question where you're the one in the back seat with Caleb, do you want to share that one?
Yeah. So, my boy, our oldest one was in 5th grade at this time. And he said, Dad, I heard that girls suck on boys' penises. And I was like, we're driving home from baseball practice. I'm like freaking out right now. Like we're moving him from that school. What little punk is teaching my kid this stuff?
Yeah.
But, once I got all this internal stuff managed, I go, yeah, actually, buddy, that is kind of a part of sex. I'd love to talk to you about that more. And really, because at that point, we still hadn't told him fully what sex is. And we're going to get to that here in a minute on our next, on one of the next tools that we want to give you. But we've tried to share control with him. And so he wasn't ready to talk about it. And he goes, no, I still don't want to know. I'm alarmed in the moment. I'm panicking. I'm like, oh no, but I want to really celebrate the fact he asked that question to me. I want to celebrate the fact he felt comfortable enough to bring that up, that he felt comfortable enough to continue this conversation. And so we talked about it to the point that he didn't want to. And then he very quickly wanted to talk about baseball or something else. And so I let him move on to the next conversation. Really important. I even think, this can backfire in some ways. One of our sons asked us what all the cuss words were. We answered the question because we've committed to answer every question. Guess what he did? He used the F word the next day at school. So, he was only in kindergarten. He didn't even know. He didn't know the weight of it. And so there's kind of that moment where you're like, okay, what do I value more? Do I value looking good to the teachers and the other parents? Or do I value establishing that I'm the source? It goes all the way back to sex as a learned behavior and establishing that power of first mention. We're going to answer every question. Why? Because I don't want my children to learn sex elsewhere. And if I'm not willing to answer it, they'll Google it. And I'm not okay with them Googling it. So I'd rather risk them having an awkward statement or say something that they maybe shouldn't in school before they actually learn the value of it, even if I try to communicate it. But establish that we're the source. So
Yeah.
anything you ask, we're going to answer anytime.
Yeah, and I think our kids know that there's lots of confusing messages in the world, and being able to say that, like, hey,
Yeah.
buddy, we want to be the people to tell you because we will tell you the truth. And if you ask elsewhere or if you base it off what you just saw in that commercial, like that's really confusing and not the truth.
Yeah.
And so being able to celebrate their questions and establish that we will tell you the whole truth.
Well, and that's a good point, babe. You know, we don't want to lie to our kids and we don't want to demean their intelligence. Super important that when they say, well, what's sex? Oh, you wouldn't understand. That's a demeaning response. And that actually communicates a lack of intelligence to our children. If we say, oh, it's your mom and dad wrestling, well, one day they're going to know it's not mom and dad wrestling. Maybe that's a part of what you do, but that's not everything that sex is. And you're now telling your child, I'm not actually going to give you a truthful answer. I'm going to give you an inaccurate answer when I feel uncomfortable. Well, you just communicated to them it's okay to lie when you're not comfortable. And so it's really important that we don't do that. We give clear, honest, truthful answers. Now, there are times where they've asked me a question that I felt like they weren't ready for. And so the language that I used in that moment was actually, I think you're really smart. I think you'd understand this. I don't know if I'm ready for you to understand this yet. It's going to steal innocence from you. It's going to be information that you can't unknow. And so why don't we do this? How about let's give it 2 weeks. And if you still feel like this is a pressing question about sex that you have to know the answer to, I'll answer it. I'd actually rather answer this when you're a little bit older. Now, I want to be the one to answer it. Don't go look it up because I will answer it if you have to know it. If a couple of days go by or a week goes by where you feel like, Dad, I got to know, I'm going to answer it for you. But why don't we give it some time and see if it still matters to you 2 weeks from now? And then I checked back. I remember this specifically. I went and checked back and said, hey, remember you asked me this? Do you still want to know? No, actually, I haven't even thought about it since we talked. I don't want to know. I actually think I'd rather wait till I'm older. Awesome. I didn't demean their intelligence.
Right.
I didn't lie to them. I actually made them a part of the process and let them kind of determine the rate that we go. And then we partner together in that.
Yeah, you shared the control with what he was comfortable with.
Super important.
One more piece too, I think, of encouragement and permission is if you do get one of those, well, not if, when you get one of those questions that you're totally off guard by, is giving yourself permission to, if you don't know what the answer is, like legitimately, they might ask you something, you're like, I don't know, because it might be some new topic, relevant term for something. Or if you're just like, man, I do not know how I want to answer this yet, you could always say, you know what, I'm so glad. I want to celebrate that you asked me that. Can you give me a little bit of time to figure that out so that I can figure out the full answer? So that the way they know too, you're engaging, you're not brushing them off, and say, hey, I'm not going to forget. We're going to talk about this later. I just need I need a minute or I need a day to really figure that out because I want to give you the best answer and the full truth. So give yourself permission to take that pressure off too. If you're like, oh, I have to answer this perfectly right now, you could give them a little piece and then be like, but I'm going to come back to you on that.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, you've referenced share control a couple times. We're going to really tackle that in the culture conversation next week. So we'll give a lot more context to that. We're just mentioning it because this is a part of the culture of our home. It's all intertwined, right? Like it all feels connected. We'll unpack that more next week. Let's get into tool number 4.
Yep.
Pay attention to embarrassment. This is so big. I think it's been a part of a lot of homes for a long time that the reason it's so embarrassing to talk about it is because we actually try to embarrass each other sometimes. The moment someone has a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a crush, it's like, oh, Caleb's got a crush, and we sing songs about it. We've actually tried to do a good job. We do the best that we can to not allow that to take place in our home. We don't want our kids to feel embarrassed. We don't want them to feel uncomfortable, and we definitely don't want them to feel embarrassed because of us. If my child is willing to take the risk, no matter what grade they're in, and come home and say, I have somebody I have a crush on, I'm not going to penalize them for taking that risk with embarrassment. I'm actually going to reward them with safety. And think about that. Make an intentional decision to do that. I'm going to reward my child asking me a question or taking the risk to share something that's going on in their world. I'm going to reward them with safety. I want my child to feel so safe to tell me they have a crush. And I might think in my head, gosh, this is far too early. You're in kindergarten. You're in first grade. My head might say this is too early for them to have a crush. My words aren't going to say that, though. I'm going to reward their risk. I want to because think about how much of a risk it is for my second grader to say, I've got a crush on somebody, for my sixth grader to say, I like somebody. And you know what? I want to buy them a gift on this trip. Can I buy a hat for this person? Well, what happens in a lot of families? Oh, Caleb wants to buy a gift for so-and-so. Look, he's got a crush, Caleb and so-and-so sitting in a tree. And we immediately take the entire tenor of the car ride or the moment in the living room, the moment in the hotel room, and we make it all about, oh, what's wrong with you? Why do you have a crush? You're too young for this. You can't tell a child they're too young to have the emotions that they have. They have those emotions. Well, I need to validate that emotion and not make them feel embarrassed. Why? Because the next time they want to take a risk to tell us about their feelings, guess what they're not going to do? They're not going to do it. And then I'm not going to have the right to these discovery conversations, because that's the ultimate goal. We're killing the talk. We're having discovery conversations. Well, in order to create the space for those discovery conversations, I've got to fight so my kids aren't embarrassed, that they feel really comfortable in the talk, these discovery conversations. I want them to feel in such a safe place that, oh man, Dad, today I tried to hold this girl's hand. And I'm thinking, this is way too early. Thankfully, this still has not happened in our life. Thank you, Jesus. But when it does, it's probably going to come earlier than I feel comfortable with, earlier than neither of us want it. We've committed to not embarrass our child in that moment, so that can turn into a great discovery conversation. Well, what do you think? And one of the ways that we've actually practically played that out in the discovery conversation with Caleb, in our middle schooler, he's currently in middle school. I don't know when you're going to watch this, but today he's in middle school. He started to have this crush, and he wanted to buy a gift for this girl, and she bought him a gift when she went on a trip. We just talked about it. I said, well, what do you think about that? He goes, I don't know, Dad. What do you think? I personally think it's too early for you to be sharing gifts, because the moment you're sharing a gift, you're establishing this as your girlfriend. Feels too early to me. What do you think a good time to have a girlfriend is, Caleb? Well, I don't know, Dad. What do you think? And we just start having this open dialogue. And I said, well, I think probably high school is a good time. Middle school feels too soon to me. I'm not telling you that you can or you can't. It just feels like you guys are too young. Your emotions are still being developed. You don't even know how to process emotion. You guys haven't hit puberty yet. That's going to change things significantly with emotion. And he wants to hit puberty so bad at this point. He's like dying for that to happen for whatever reason. He's decided, I got to hit this. Like, it's his next goal in life. And he goes, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I said, I don't think that you can guard her heart properly right now. And the moment you buy her a gift, you're kind of making a statement. You're my girlfriend. He goes, yeah, that's a good point. And so he decided on this trip to not buy her a gift. It was a decision that we talked about, but he came to of his own. Why? Because we leaned into this discovery conversation. Yeah. We didn't embarrass him that he wanted to buy her a gift. We actually unpacked why he wanted to and what it felt like it would communicate to give that gift to her when we got back from this trip. And he decided, yeah, I'm not ready to communicate that to her yet. I'm not. And I was thankful that he wasn't willing to. And it was so important that we didn't embarrass as he asked questions in the years leading up, so that we had the right to have this conversation. We reward really big questions with safety. We don't punish them with embarrassment. We make sure that they feel safe, which leads us to the last tool that we're really going to dive into next week. We're just going to brush on it right now, which is culture over conversation. That's what we want to ultimately commit to.
Yeah, because ultimately, really, this whole picture paints that we are creating a culture in our home where they feel super comfortable. So it's not just the one conversation, it's a culture. We're going to do all of the tools next week with Jason and Lauren on how to create the culture. But the thing we wanted to brush on right here is making sure you're okay with the process.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times if we're focused on it being one conversation, then you're thinking I'm delivering the whole package. We're not delivering a whole package ever. It's a process of conversations. So it's funny, as I remember the first time our kids heard the word sex, they actually heard it as six, and they kept saying 666. So then we corrected them instead of avoiding it, which, fear might be like, oh, I could just avoid it still because he's saying the wrong thing. It's like, no, we correct it. We say, actually, I think the word you mean is sex. And then we go after that. But that doesn't mean we're telling him everything that sex is. So it's the process of realizing it's a process you're walking through that you have to be okay with. It's not just a package you're delivering one day and you get to just drop the whole load off. And so even with the situation with him liking girls, part of me is like, oh, wow. So then I need to talk to him about this and this and this. I'm like, oh, no, I don't. It's not time for that yet. He is too young. He doesn't need to know that. And I think even they want to kind of rush it sometimes when they're like, oh, when you buy gifts and all of this. So it's really being okay with the process and the whole thing, and knowing we're creating and establishing a culture in our home, not just a conversation that's a delivery package one day. It's a process that we get to go and
Yeah.
entertain conversations with them all the time and use every opportunity when it comes up and make the most of it.
Yeah. So we're excited to talk about how to build that culture next week in the next session. But just to kind of recap, we want to kill the talk. It's so important. If you don't take anything else from this, kill the talk and commit to discovery conversations that take place over their entire childhood and really even into their adult life. Establish sex isn't a bad word. It's actually a really good word. Number 3, no question's a bad question. Answer everything they ask honestly with clarity. If you leave it unclear, they're going to go find the answer. If you don't answer it honestly, they're going to go find the answer. And if you demean their intelligence, they're going to go find the answer. They're going to go find someone that thinks that they're able to handle that information. Pay attention to embarrassment. Don't forget to pay close attention to that. Reward their risk-taking of talking to you, mom and dad, with safety. Don't punish them with embarrassment, and then commit to culture over conversation. That's so important. Make sure we're committing to culture over conversation. Way to go, continuing to lean into this. Man, you're already on week 5. Amazing. We're halfway there together in this, as far as the information goes. I mean, you're not halfway there implementing it, but we're halfway there in the information gathering, and we're just believing and trusting that God is turning this information into revelation and you're implementing it in your home. We're so excited to be doing this journey with you. We can't wait to talk about culture in the next session.